I've been told that because we are running late, that we have to be very strict, and I will keep this session to 1 hour as it's supposed to be. So 3 o'clock now, we're going to finish at 4 o'clock, and I would like everybody to actually help me do that. Start a slow hand clap at 4 o'clock if we haven't finished. You may see me looking at my phone. It's not because I'm going to be checking the emails and various other things. It's because I will be timing each of our speakers. And to save time, I'm not going to introduce the speakers separately. I'll leave them in 25 words or less to introduce themselves at the start of their particular session. At which point I should introduce myself. My name is Frank Ashe. I'm an independent consultant. An anecdote that's relevant to the last session. One of my colleagues who I went through university with in the actuarial stream, her first job was actually in the banking sector. So that was over 40 years ago. And in fact, a colleague of mine now, we're on the same board of a startup in the finance area. He likes to say that he employed her. So he was the first person in a banking area to actually employ an actuary. So that was 1976. So actuaries in Australia have been in the banking sector since 1976. So that's quite a long time. But we're not talking about banking, we're talking about something of immense importance, climate change and sustainability. And in particular, what can actuaries do about climate change? My interest in climate change has been there since the year dot. People who are familiar with the climate change literature and the debate in other countries about that might remember that people talk about a Time magazine back in 1970-odd, which talked about global cooling. You know, we could be heading into an ice age rather than global warming. Yes, I actually read that article when it first came out. And that was one of the things I was reading that interested me in climate change. And I've been following it ever since. One of the things that amazes me is that it has not gained enough attention. And it's really something that is on both sides of the political spectrum. The IPCC, which many people say is government and should be, what's government doing getting into this area? The IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, two of the people who pushed that were Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. So you can't get people who are more left-wing than that. So it covers both sides of the political spectrum. It should be having much greater effect on what is happening. Now we have got actuaries who are working on this. Over in North America, the Society of Actuaries, the Casualty Actuarial Society, the American Academy of Actuaries, the Canadian Society of Actuaries, they've got together and they have an actuarial climate index. The Australian actuaries have put together a climate index there. These climate indexes are useful for insurers and other planners because they concentrate on things like the 99th percentile. What's the chance of actually something going really badly? As well as giving us information on the general trend of climate change over a longer term time span. And we have support from regulators. The Australian regulator is very big on climate change, wants to make sure that people are appropriately taking that into account in insurance and in banking. So I'll leave that now because these people here have got a number of points to get through. And it'll take about half an hour to go through their slides. I will be timing them very rigorously. The slides that they have to get through, I looked at them, read them and figured out that they'd be good enough for me to do a 2-day workshop with. we're going to have to get through it in half an hour. So enough from me. Let's go over to our speakers. And as I said, they'll introduce themselves when they get to the microphone. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ashe, for opening the platform for us. So in this presentation today, we are going to talk about climate change. How does this work? It's not working. Excuse me, it's not working. All right, thank you. So I'll start by mentioning 3 things about India, which you may or may not be aware about. India is the second largest consumer of coal, followed by China. India, an agrarian economy, supports 17% of the world's population on merely 4% of freshwater resources. And the Economic Survey of 2018 highlighted the fact that climate change is taking a toll on India's agricultural productivity and farmers' income. Thirdly, India is most at risk from climate change based on ranking by HSBC in 2018, and over 600 million people will be moderately or severely affected by changes in temperature and rainfall as per the World Bank report released in June 2018. The underlying message is that climate change is one of the biggest challenges and risks that we are facing, be it in India and worldwide, and it is going to be a major source of uncertainty for insurers for the coming years. I'm going to take this opportunity to quote the ex-chairman and CEO of AXA, Mr. Henry D. Castries, who in 2014 said that climate change for us is neither an ideological nor a theoretical issue. It is a core business issue, as we are already seeing the impact of increasing weather-related disaster risks. In this presentation, we'll start with an overview of climate risks and the impact that it is going to have on the work of insurance practitioners and on the GI side as well as on the life side. Obviously, when we think about climate change, the question that always crosses our minds is that, is it for real? Is climate change actually happening? Does it pose any threat? Well, the scientific evidence is clear and unequivocal that climate change is happening, and it is largely induced by man-made activities, mainly greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists are as clear about the link between climate change and human behavior as they are clear on the link between smoking and lung cancer. The 2019 edition of Global Risks Report by World Economic Forum ranked environmental threat as top of the list for 3rd year in a row. I'll now let my colleague Alasdair speak on, or give an overview on climate risks.
Thank you very much, Shraddha. So just to introduce myself briefly, my name's Alasdair. I'm currently working in PwC's office in Mumbai, team of about 40 actuarial consultants. I'm here on secondment from the UK, where I grew up with PwC's actuarial consulting practice. And the reason why I'm talking about this topic is that I recently joined the IFOA's Resource and Environment Board, climate change being one of its key focuses. We do a range of things to support actuaries in the UK Institute consider climate change more clearly during their work. One of the big things our board did was release a risk alert. Something else I'll be doing this month is a peer review of the actuarial climate index from the American associations that Frank mentioned. So yeah, really, really excited to be talking to you about this topic today. And I'll start my section by talking about two really key, I suppose, pieces of not regulatory but intergovernmental frameworks that will hopefully help to drive some of the big changes in the global economy that's needed to meet the challenges of climate change in the years and decades ahead. Now, the first is one you've probably heard of, which is the Paris Agreement. It was all over the news back in 2015 when 200 countries, almost every country in the world, agreed this new framework sponsored by the UN to firstly try and keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial global average temperatures. And if at all possible, keep them to 1.5 degrees above global average temperatures. Now, I was thinking about this morning, and it struck me the similarity in this kind of broad, overarching, certainly very noble objective. It struck me that it felt a bit like the risk-based capital regime in Europe and similar replications of that around the world, which say we want all insurance companies to have less than half a percent, 1 in 200 chance of going insolvent within the next year. It's another broad statement, but the actual analysis and maths and actuarial work that might need to go behind actually achieving that kind of statement is huge, and it's the same with this climate target, I would suggest. So what does the Paris Agreement involve? Well, there are a range of facets to it alongside this 2% / 1.5% target, along with targeting a limit to global temperature rises linked to reductions in emissions. You also have targets around adapting to a harsher and more volatile climate. And a big part of that is recognizing that some countries have more developed economies than others. A lot of these developed economies have benefited from a lot of greenhouse gas emissions to get them to the developed stage that their economies now find themselves. So a big part of the Paris Agreement was setting up a framework to recognise some of the equity and some of the financial assistance that was needed to happen for some of those developed economies to help less developed economies grow their economies in a way that wasn't going to blow this 2 degree target out of the water. So there's a framework in place for more developed economies to give financial support to less developed economies. And making those financial flows is really important. Another big area is disclosure, which takes me on to the next topic on this side. Starting in 2023, so this Paris Agreement becomes binding. It officially starts in 2020. 2023, there's going to be something called a global stocktake. So all of the countries that are signed up to this agreement have to report on how they're getting on with their emissions reduction targets. And they have to make a new one for the next period of 5 years following that that's more ambitious than before. Everyone's signed up to this. So the idea of reporting, disclosure and transparency is really important. And that takes me on to the next topic on this slide, which is all about that. This is a working group, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, that's been set up by the Global Advisory Board on Financial Disclosures, the FSB. And the aim of this TCFD is to say, well, there are a huge number of risks caused by climate change to individual companies and organisations' financials going forward. And for investors to allocate capital efficiently to those companies, those companies need to start being really clear and transparent about what the risks are to their organisations from climate change and what they're doing to manage them. So that's what the TCFD is doing. It has a panel of global experts from some of the world's biggest financial institutions and non-financial companies to come up with a set of guidelines to help companies understand what they need to do to disclose their climate risks clearly in their public disclosures, their financial statements. And you know, if you don't do this, we've actually already seen some companies, certainly in my home country, the UK, several insurance companies have actually been sued and taken to court in the last year. Last year, a climate NGO took 3 UK insurers to court because they actually referred them to the Financial Conduct Authority because they felt they hadn't adequately disclosed climate risks in their financial statements. So that's a real tangible impact that's happened already to financial institutions in the UK, which brings it a bit closer to home and makes you realise that climate change is no longer some far off topic. The key risks that this task force identify, I'll come on to in the next few slides, because it's not just the risk of weather disasters and higher temperatures and droughts that will affect institutions. So that's one of them. Physical risk is certainly one. You know, we've seen a lot of you know, more volatile, more extreme events, as I'm sure you've seen in the news over the last few years. Only a couple of weeks ago, in the UK, the UK had its warmest ever winter temperatures. People outside in the park sunbathing in February is pretty unheard of. In Edinburgh, so right up in Scotland, you know, north, very cold territory usually, there was actually a grass fire just outside of Edinburgh, and the grassland just outside of Edinburgh. So, you know, really volatile, extreme events, very hard to predict. That's the first one, physical risk. That's okay. I'll finish off quickly. So physical risk is one. Another one is transition risk. So huge change to the economy needed in order to meet this 2-degree target. And that is going to be a huge shift to the economy. Some things like we heard about coal. Some of those coal reserves in India may well become stranded assets. And then liability risk as well. So Frank said in the 70s, there was still confusion. People were talking about global cooling rather than global warming. But actually, by the late 80s, it was pretty scientifically irrefutable fact that man-made warming was happening, and some of these companies have known about that for quite a long time. And just one example, Exxon, one of the world's biggest oil companies, is now being taken to court because the New York prosecutors are saying that they've known about this risk for a long time and they decided it wasn't in their interest to disclose. So it could be a huge, huge liability risk event. And you know, given our actuarial focus, where we do a lot of our work in the Institute at the moment is in insurance companies, I'm going to hand back to Shraddha and her colleague Ravi to talk about the particular considerations for general insurers. Thanks.
Thank you, Alistair, for talking about the 3 risks. Clearly, climate change has a holistic effect as a risk, and it affects people and companies. We have to understand that climate change is not just about more claims, be it increasing frequency or more expensive claims, but it impacts other other aspects such as insurability. For example, with increasing coastal erosion that is happening, parts of Kolkata and Mumbai may be more vulnerable to the effects of sea rise, and some of the infrastructures may become uninsurable or expensive to insure. So naturally, it's a question of insurability. It's also a question of affordability. Can we continue to insure some of the low-risk areas that have now become high risks? Or if we increase the premium, can the insured afford to actually buy insurance? So it's also a question of affordability. And then there are also reputational issues. For example, if we say no to a particular infrastructure, or if an insurance company does not move away from a carbon-intensive investment methodology. So if we just think solely in terms of more losses, we are missing the big picture. And I have to admit that this presentation is going to bring more questions to your mind than it can possibly provide answers to. But at least it is going to give some food for thought on the topic. In the next few slides, we'll see how it is going to impact general insurers through reserving, pricing function, risk management, investment, etc. Talking about pricing, many general insurance products are annually renewable contracts, so it is very tempting for us to assume that only small changes are going to happen, and they'll naturally pick themselves up as we annually renew the contract, and only small changes in premium are going to be needed to reflect these changes. However, acute physical risks such as catastrophes can distort the data. Chronic physical risks such as regular increase in the sea level can affect the risks overall. And as such, the trends may become difficult to identify. Transition and liability risks, which Alistair spoke about, can bring about step changes in the regulatory and legal environment. So yes, the climate change is going to increase the uncertainty about the trends in the data and the degree of reliance that we can place on the past data. So as pricing practitioners, we have to consider the ways in which the climate change is going to affect the past data, the likely impact it is going to have on the trends, and the outlook for the future. Having said that, if we are not able to place a sufficient degree of confidence in our previous data, then we may have to look at alternative sources of data for pricing, which is already happening in crop insurance in India, where we are relying on weather index insurance. And when we are relying on alternative sources of data, we have to make sure that we are keeping in mind the possible biases and errors that can be introduced in the process. And they can be particularly sensitive to climate change assumptions. So sensitivities of such indices will also have to be kept in mind. Also, pricing is just one lever with which the insurers or the climate risk can come into the books of insurers. There are other aspects such as policy wordings. We may have to review the policy wordings to weed out hidden exposures which are leading to environmental liability. There can be underwriting. Rules may have to be changed to be adapted to climate change. For example, when some coastal areas become uninsurable, or climate change may create risks in new areas which were previously considered low risks. And lastly, it is also about new opportunities. For example, new products can come, such as property insurance offering rebuilding with more sustainable green products. There can be reimbursement for renewable energy use, insurance for renewable energy projects and properties. And also, we can provide incentives to insureds who are mitigating or adapting to climate change. For example, those who are opting for electric cars, low mileage discounts for loss mitigation devices. That's on the pricing side. On the reserving side, practitioners need to consider what is the potential reserve deterioration that can happen, and what is the increased uncertainty in the claims from physical transition and liability risks. Fundamental to reserving is that for established lines of business, we place a lot of reliance on the past data. Naturally, the uncertainty about the future is going to reduce the confidence that we can place in such data. So there are two aspects that reserving practitioners need to consider: the extent to which the uncertainties are going to affect the future climate claim costs, and also how the mix and development of claims may change. For example, if we think about electric cars, well, they could be safer and slower with better safety features, or they could be more susceptible to battery fires. Either way, it is going to change the risk mix of the auto portfolio, and we may have to anticipate this in the reserving process. Another example would be for liability policies, such as under DNO policies, there may be increased litigation if the board is found to be negligent in enforcing general environmental regulations or on engineers and architects' policies. Physical asset owners may be sued if it is found to be causing environmental damage. Naturally, these are going to take long to ascertain the liability under these policies, but somewhere they have to be a part of our thinking process when we are trying to reserve. Potential latent claims may arise. For example, energy-saving LED devices have been found to pose potential health concerns. They can cause blaring in the eyes. So for these reasons, practitioners are encouraged to produce a range of scenarios and present their impact analysis for these, and use this judgment in some way when they're deciding their best estimate reserves. Having said that, it is always important to bear the principle of proportionality in mind, and ideally the focus should be on climate areas which have the greatest impact on the existing reserves. There are some questions that we can think of on both the pricing and reserving side with respect to each of the risks. So on physical risks, for example, will the incidence of flooding events increase, decrease with changed weather patterns? Will it warrant a separate detailed analysis? Or can there be indirect effects? For example, there could be health concerns when there's an increased seawater intrusion on the land. It can lead to an outbreak of cholera. There can be changes in agricultural patterns, which may eventually mean that there's going to be a change in there's going to be a shift in the claim patterns. On the transitional risk side, there could be new and emerging risks as we move away from thermal power plants to wind, solar, tidal biofuels, etc. So we have to anticipate that in the pricing process. For example, Allianz found that offshore wind farms are creating increasing collision risks for vessels. And lastly, on the liability side, well, there can be that a new category of liability claims may gain traction in the court. And also, it is important to bear in mind whether the claims made or losses made policies are going to be more exposed to the latent claims. So as actuaries, it is important for us to use these assumptions and models that are fit for purpose and communicate the material risks and uncertainties to clients. I'm now going to let Ravi speak on other topics of GI.
Thank you, Shraddha. I'm Ravi. I'm working with KPMG Global Services, and I'm working on multiple advisory projects related to independent reserve reviews and Solvency II, also including the calculation of solvency capital requirement. Okay, so we'll move on to three other important aspects that's related to change in climate and the risk cost due date. So one would be the reinsurance, the other would be how the company would be managing the investment portfolio, and the last one would be how the restructuring going to be around the risk and capital management. So when we talk about reinsurance, so reinsurance is going to be impacted heavily by the change in climate. This is because there would be a systematic change in the level of how the environment is going to work. Taking a simple example, so with the rise in sea levels and warming of Earth's surface, it has been seen that since last 3 years, the number of hurricanes has increased by a large number. And the damage caused by these hurricanes in the last 3 years have almost a collective damage of $135 billion. Now, if we talk about this $135 billion, this is equivalent to 1 in 10 years of loss, which has moved from 1 in 100 years equivalent of loss. This gives an example of where we are moving in terms of climate change risk and how it's going to impact the reinsurance. This specifically will also impact the price of individual losses that the insurers are facing. As I said, this would be related to the insurability and affordability of the reinsurance products that the reinsurance companies are having these days. Having said this, this will also be an opportunity for insurance and reinsurance companies to bring in new products, analyzing the past data and see what kind of future claims are expected, or parameterizing and properly calibrating the CAT models and performing enough stress and stress test to see where they can do more innovation and bring more innovative products for insurance companies. Historically, it has been observed that reinsurance companies have spent enough time and money in doing researches to potentially identify the reason for climate change and the result due to the climate changes. They could help the cedents, and in that way the insurers could identify the risk that are associated with their portfolio, and they can go into the insurance and buy the right reinsurance product. When we talk about the investment strategy for a company, we should be focusing mostly towards the physical risk and the transition risk that a company is having. Now, physical risk would be something that would be a threat to the infrastructure or the real estates. For example, the threats arising from the rising sea levels or extreme weather conditions. For example, tsunami, drought, which would actually result in mass migration away from the coastal regions. Many people leaving their livelihood and moving towards other locations, which would also have a consequential economical impact. This would also cause various properties that they have left behind, the prices of those properties to fall down. Many of the insurance companies might have investments in those kind of properties. Then moving on to transition risk, it's basically a possibility of fall in the values of assets which are related to high carbon intensive investments. This would cause increase in stranded assets, as talked about Alice does in his slides. Also, the decrease in value of assets would be due to the changes in legislations to deal with the climate change. Many portfolio will see their value go down because some of the investors would move from investing in traditional carbon-intensive bonds to different kind of other technologies, such as greener energy or some new investments specifically related to hybrid cars, electric cars. Once we are talking about the investment strategy, it's also important to know how the environment, social, and governance strategy is going to impact the key strategies of a company, because these three factors would be key in measuring the sustainability and ethical impact of the investments a company is making in. Firm must also not forget to keep key important point in mind, because if firms are investing in a particular asset, they can't be just blindfolded. They have to invest in assets and instruments, the risk of which they can identify and control and report, and also see how it can help improving the liquidity when a specific claim arises due to the major climate event. Three things that are important for an insurance company to focus on. They should set a proper approach on how to manage the climate risk change in terms of the investment portfolio. They should try and arrange for a carbon audit, and they should also ask their investment managers to provide details on steps of how they have been doing the investments. The last thing that I'll talk about is risk management and capital management. Now, a risk management function of the insurance companies should actively consider how to integrate the other functions of the company, and they should try and make them aware of what kind of changes will be there and what kind of risk will be there from climate change perspective. If they are unaware, they should try and build knowledge sessions for them, perform trainings, show them different case studies of how the risk can be mitigated, and with the sole purpose of integrating the climate change risk in their overall risk portfolio. Further role would be to access and monitor different kind of stress and scenario testing, which would identify the emerging climate risk and would also enable the companies to expand their horizon. Also, a company should try to assess the potential climate change with respect to short-term, mid-term, and long-term time horizon. They should try and incorporate the various climate risks in their risk registration, which would help them to classify, quantify, mitigate, and take appropriate actions. They should also do a carry-forward stress testing, because this would help them in linking the transition risk and the physical risk. At last, there should be appropriate disclosures, which would be based on TCFD recommendations, as mentioned by Alistair. The disclosures would obviously be voluntary at this moment. There is no regulatory requirement. But whenever we talk about voluntary, it's always a green area, and sometimes people tend to avoid it, and that's where the key challenges lies in. So Marzan will be taking you through the life insurance impact. Over to you, Masha.
Thank you, Ravi. Good afternoon. My name is Marjan Ghazvini. I'm working at Heriot-Watt University, Malaysia campus. I'm a lecturer there. I got my PhD from University of Melbourne in actuarial studies, and I got my bachelor degree from Iran in insurance management. The reason that I'm giving this talk is that I'm part of the IFOA's Life Insurance Working Party, and I'm very interested in research related to industry. So this talk is about the impact of climate change on life insurance. And during the past year, we tried to see how climate change can affect life insurance and what life insurance company can do about it. We know that there are two risks exposed to life insurance companies which are very important. One of them is investment risk, and the other one is the mortality risk. Climate change can physically affect the properties. For example, the rise of sea levels, and also this affects the properties in coastline, and this may affect their mortgages as well. Another problem of climate change is stranded assets. At one point, the insurance companies must transit from holding bond and equities in carbon-producing companies and change this to more environmentally friendly companies. And this is the problem of a stranded asset that may be the result of change in regulations or change in the demands by investors. For example, they may require a new product design and investment in funds that take into consideration the ESG, which is environmental, societal, and governance factors. And what is the implication on life actuaries is that they need to take this into consideration when they provide advice and consultation to life insurance companies. The impact of climate change and the financial impact of climate change on different products is different. So, for example, the products with longer term, like annuities and conventional life insurance, are highly affected by climate change. But there are some other products with reviewable risk and are less affected by climate change. But one of the problems of climate change is that the scaling is unknown, the impact is unknown, and the timing is unknown, and the risk is irreversible. So we need to take this into account when we model climate change, and we try to incorporate this in the modeling, like, for example, reserving and pricing of the life insurance companies. So this is what life insurance company can do about this. Building awareness and identification of the risk is very important. After that, they can do qualitative analysis, like scenario analysis. We believe in this working party that such analysis must be incorporated into ERM, enterprise risk and risk management, financial planning, and also of the company. And the next stage, which is not easy, is the quantitative analysis, which requires credible, relevant, and sufficient data, which is not available yet. But this is something that requires more research in the future. So the first stage is risk identification and building awareness. And we need to know that the climate change is irreversible. When we model this, we need to take into consideration the interrelationship between the risk. The broad effects and uncertain time horizon of the climate change is also very important. This is the way that we can do in order to identify different types of risk. For example, market, longevity, mortality, and a strategic risk, and also operational risk. When we have a met-risk risk, we can categorize these risks on the physical and transitional risk. For example, market risk, like interest rate, can be categorized on the transitional risk. And also we have operational risk, which is more serious for companies that they outsource administration. In scenario analysis and qualitative analysis, it is important to consider, to distinguish the difference between trends and shock. So, for example, we have the climate change may lead to higher mortality. This is especially the case when we have extreme weather conditions. But on the other hand, we know that in recent years, mortality rate, the longevity is increasing at a decreasing rate. So this is a kind of trend that we need to distinguish from the shock. We can have multiple scenarios, and then we need to consider the relationship between these scenarios. We have internal and external sectors, and also a scenario analysis must be in narrative forms. So in the long term, the insurance companies need to have sufficient and credible data, and using this data, they can incorporate their modeling in, they can incorporate the analysis in their modeling, like pricing, and using demographic changes and other factors in capital management and reserving. Like many other risks, it's not just about downside risk. Climate change can bring about opportunities for life insurance companies. For example, product design and investing in green technology and more sustainable energy like wind energy, nuclear energy, solar energy can be different sources of investment for life insurance companies. Shraddha and I are part of the working party, and this study is based on this working party, and here we have, you can see the name of the members. So, You can see the name of the members. We are all happy to discuss more about our work, and this work will be available soon and will be published in the future, but in a very near future. Thank you.
Okay, I tried to keep my own speakers within time, but there is just so much to talk about with this area. They went over time. So we still have 16 minutes of questions from the audience if they have any. Other than that, I have some questions for the panel. So, questions from the audience. Yes, I see a gentleman over there in a pink shirt. While we're waiting for the microphone to get to him, one thing that I'd like to stress is that notice a lot of this work here is talking about predictions that we need to do, predictions that you need to do. And just remember that there's three eras of prediction. And you've got the fact that the world is stochastic, you've got the fact that you don't know the parameters of the model that you're working with. Heat is increasing. There's more and more warmth. At what rate is it increasing? We don't know. We can measure how fast it's increased in the past, but we need to know how much it's going to increase in the future. And the third source of error is one of the biggest ones that we have trouble with, and that is that we don't know what model to use in the future. Which doesn't mean that we throw our hands up and don't do anything. It means that we actually have to build those things properly into all of our decision-making process. I am involved in the SERA course, and so when Marjan mentioned ERM, that was, yes, you need to have ERM. And that's enterprise risk management, so you need to take all of this sort of stuff into account. The fact that you don't know something needs to affect the amount of capital and needs to affect your decision-making process. So, gentleman in the pink.
So my name is Ayan Shukla. I work with Bajaj Allianz General Insurance. My question may not be very much relevant to what has been discussed here, but it comes out of more concern than anything else. I just wanted to know that during all the process of your preparation of the whole presentation and working behind this whole topic, did you come across this thought, because it just came to me, that can insurance play a role in mitigating the deterioration in climate change rather than measuring what will happen after the climate get deteriorated? In the sense, we have the measures, and you just have discussed that how we can measure the bad impacts or the negative externalities of climate changes and the deterioration of climate. But can we discuss about where insurance can play a role, where we can conserve the climate rather than waiting for the deterioration and then measuring it, rather than so that was the point. It comes out of more concern than anything else. So it's a question to the panel and to you, Dr. Frank, also.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And if I may have first crack at it, because you guys spoke for a long and I was waiting to say something. Insurance can have a very big effect on how we actually handle climate change, because it's a good way of actually making sure that we get a price signal. And we need, for example, in Sydney, there are suburbs that are going to disappear by 2100, or at least the houses next to the beaches. They really are uninsurable now. They're not, because there are all sorts of restrictions as to what people can charge for insurance of those houses. The situation in the US is even worse. But if insurers were allowed to actually charge the appropriate rates, in the next few years we would see a groundswell of opinion from people to say, hey, we've got to do something about it because I can't insure my home. Now, that's happening in some areas of Australia because of bushfires. People can't get insurance for their house because they want to build it where, there's the chance of having a catastrophic bushfire. That's the sort of thing that we need. The trouble is that the typical politician's response to a groundswell of disaffection by the public is usually to put a price limit on it and tell the insurance companies they're not allowed to charge the proper price. But the other way that actuaries can actually do that is by driving government action, putting a proper price to say, hey, here's the price that it's actually going to cost the government in the future, the cost of actually not doing something. You're going to have to step in as the insurer of last resort. That's effectively what the government is. When something catastrophic happens and you have to say this area is just unlivable now, we have to pull everybody out, the government has to pick up that cost. And so actuaries can help determine that cost. Anybody on the panel wish to say something? Yes, Alistair. Do we have a mic for the panel? Yeah, good.
Yeah, just one more thought I had on how insurers can drive change. Of course, the world's biggest insurance companies are among the largest institutional investors in the world. So the point around divestment from fossil fuels, insurers certainly need to play a leading role there, and I believe they are starting to. I believe AXA, obviously one of the very biggest insurance institutions, has said it will divest from fossil fuels, and I'm sure others will follow. So that's another way that insurers can drive, I suppose, prevention rather than mitigation, which I think was your question.
Yep, that's a big thing in Australia at the moment too. A number of our superannuation portfolios are divesting, and they get a lot of flack from the Conservative members of the community and of Parliament for doing it.
I can give a couple of examples. For example, one of the biggest insurance companies, they have stopped writing policies for energy companies who have exposure to 30% and or more towards coal. The second would be a report from asset owners disclosures. Top 80 insurance companies across the world, they have about 15 trillion of assets under management. Out of those 15 trillion, only 0.5% are being invested towards low intensity carbon investment. So there is such a huge potential to move from 0.5% towards 100%. So certainly insurance companies can help in mitigating the climate change risk.
Right, that was a good question. Any other questions? It's a bit hard for me to see with the light. There we are, that's better. Okay, I'm surprised. Go on. There must be questions about climate change. You've got whole areas over there near Calcutta which are going to disappear in climate change soon. West Antarctic ice shelf, that starts moving. East Bengal is gone. Anybody from the Calcutta area? Kolkata?
Hello.
Yes.
This is you. Okay. Hi, I'm Soumya from Willis Towers Watson. I work in the GI industry. I have a question for the esteemed panel. What is the sort of role do meteorologists, oceanographers, seismologists have to play? And how can we take their knowledge into the actuarial field and work towards a sustainable climate, that sort of modeling exercise in terms of pricing and reserving? What sort of role do external stakeholders play for us?
Okay. Anybody on the panel wish to answer that one before I jump in? I have a tendency to speak way too much.
So I think the question was around how do actuaries work best with meteorologists, who are obviously the people who best understand the science behind how the climate is changing. So the point I was going to make is to maybe draw a parallel with the mortality investigations that actuaries are obviously heavily involved in. They do a lot of the data analysis and draw statistical conclusions from mortality data. But we're not necessarily experts in some of the scientific and biological reasons or even social reasons that might be driving changes in mortality. So I would liken it to that. The American institutes that are working on an actuary's climate index, they're not all meteorologists. A lot of them are actuaries without a meteorological background, but you can certainly still bring a lot of actuarial skills to bear to analyse some of the trends in data, be sceptical about some of the data that you're getting and drawing and communicating appropriate conclusions. So I see us working with meteorologists in this field in a similar kind of way. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There is already, if you read the IPCC reports, there is already a very large discussion about the uncertainty in these various predictions. So, you know, it's not that, oh, we're predicting it's going to get to 2 degrees in such and such a time period. There is a very great degree of uncertainty, and actuaries should be used to this degree of uncertainty, especially those actuaries who are doing reserving and pricing in reinsurance. You know, I mean, sometimes in reinsurance you don't have data. You know, the first data that you're going to get is when something goes wrong. So, you know, people in reinsurance are used to having a lot of, you know, problems where they actually don't get a lot of data. So, yeah, bring all of that knowledge from areas where you know you don't have much data. General insurance is rife with this as well. Yeah, and bring it here and just say, look, I now have this other source of great uncertainty, and it's climate change. You don't need to know a lot of details. You need to know the uncertainty that we have in this. That's the big thing. Where's the uncertainty that we have in our projections? And work with that. Any other questions? We've got 5 more minutes for questions. Okay. Yes, there's a question there in the middle. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My question is more
Can you just introduce yourself, please?
My name is Abhijit. I work with Munich Re. And my question is more about, whenever we talk about climate change, it's a behavioral thing that we always think that it's somebody else's problem. So till the time we start believing as a community or as a like global world that it is our own problem, I don't think it will have a problem. Otherwise, even if you look at the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the problem main was fighting between the developed and the developing nations. Generally, it was like, okay, somebody else's problem, not our problem. So what are your thoughts on that? How do we sort of work around this?
Well, that sounds more like a problem for the politicians and the social scientists. However, as everybody here is doing the CIRA qualification and is interested in enterprise risk management, so you need to be aware of these risks. Anybody in the panel over there want to talk about how we can actually mobilise the people? It's not your problem, it's my problem. How do we actually change that mindset?
So actually, it's not just the problem for the developed nations. It's a problem, or for developing nations, it's a problem that the entire world is facing, and it's no longer an emerging risk. It is something which is happening, and each one is bearing the brunt of it. And I believe that there's always something that each one of us can do. Obviously, we cannot just directly control the climate change, but something at our end, for example, being more careful about the way we dispose waste, and because ultimately when the waste and the landfills get dumped, basically when all the waste goes to the landfills, that adds to the pollution. So I think each and every one of us has a role to play, not just in being as actuaries, but being as responsible humans.
I think in today's date, most of the companies, especially the shareholders, they think about the green bottom line. They are quite keen about having higher investment return. Unless they start investing more and more towards new technology, for example, greener energy, new technology related to hybrid cars, electric cars. I think focus should be there. Focus should be to invest more and more in those kind of technologies. And if they don't invest in those areas, it might be possible that there is no return for them. So I think more and more investment in those areas might ensure more returns for them, and then I think there would be some incentive for them to do something greater good for the climate.
And in the last minute, I will have the word on how can we actually mobilise the masses. And I'm reminded of whose face appears on your banknotes. It's a famous person who who was very prominent in mobilising the masses about something that India found very important, 80 years ago. I have to remember how to do my mathematics. Let's hope that it doesn't need somebody as charismatic as Mahatma Gandhi to actually mobilise the people. But, if somebody like that comes up and can actually mobilise everybody to say, hey, we just have to put aside our differences. We all have to pull together on this. We all have to do it. Now, I would be extremely pleased. I'd like it if we didn't have to rely on somebody like that. But if that person wants to turn up, I'll follow her, because it's most probably going to be a woman. So, on that note, I would like to thank my panel for a very good discussion on this matter, and thank you for your patience and for your questions. Right. And now I think it's time for afternoon tea, isn't it?
May I request Dr. Frank Ashe to felicitate the panel of speakers?
And I've been told that these lovely information diagrams that are being drawn over there are going to be on display outside. So if anybody wants to get pictures of them, then that will be available there. I reckon they're really great. I presume because SCORE is the name next to it, that's the company that's promoting that. But that woman over there is doing a very good job. Thank you.
May I request Dr. Frank Ashe to felicitate Mr. Elsder? Ms. Shraddha Shroff. Mr. Ravi Shankar Lal. May I request Mr. Sanjeev Kumar to please come on stage to felicitate Dr. Frank Ashe?